really want to get you guys' thoughts on the receiving group. This is a completely transformed receiver room, right, Brendan?
Yeah, they added 4 transfers in the offseason. Now, obviously, Winston Wright has some limitations with the injury that he suffered in a car accident over the spring. I think that's been pretty well documented, and that really uh, beyond the scope of the accident, and it seems like he's moving in a good direction with rehab. But just a football perspective, purely, like, that was a toughie for Florida State because Winston Wright was uh, kind of the crown jewel of your transfer class for wide receivers. He had about 1,200 receiving yards over 2 seasons at West Virginia, a pretty dynamic kickoff returner, which is something Florida State needed, and had a chance to kind of develop into that true number one that Florida State really hasn't had for several seasons now. But I will say an optimistic standpoint when looking at the transfer wide receivers, and I'm sure the guys can give you more insight on a few of them, but I want to focus on Deuce Spann simply because when he came here in the spring, he was a converted quarterback who played a little bit of wide receiver at Illinois. When he did catch the ball, he was extremely explosive, but just didn't get a ton of at-bats at Illinois. And you kind of saw why early on at Florida State. Like the spring, he was just extremely raw, not really natural in attacking the ball, trying to catch the ball, just like he was fighting it. The routes he was running, kind of clunky, awkward. I remember thinking to myself, like, yeah, he's a project, but like that's not even like he has a year to. He may not be someone who could contribute for a year if he contributes at all because he just looked so unnatural. Fast forward to 9-10 days into camp, and I'm not totally convinced that he's a guy who helps a ton this season, but he's shown enough to where I think you have to consider finding ways to get him the football, whether it's on kickoff return, whether it's dialing up deep shots for him and kind of forcing the issue there, getting creative in other ways. You get Deuce Spann the football. He has transformed his body. He's added probably about 10, 15 pounds. They always say that in the offseason, but he does legitimately look different. He is extremely fast, which was already well documented, but what's standing out is he's catching the ball more cleanly, more consistently. Apparently was really good in the scrimmage yesterday, but it's been pretty good all preseason. And the route running just looks, it's not totally crisp yet, but there are things he's doing in terms of just breaking off the ball and looking more natural than he did a few months ago. So to me, that's a really pleasant surprise for Florida State because I had kind of written him off as someone who could help out this season. At this point, I think he's someone that you have to kind of account for in your game planning at least a few times during the season. So yeah, Deuce Spann might change the complexion of the wide receiver room, which I would have never guessed a few months ago.
Yeah, and I want to go to Ben here from Tomahawk Nation. One name we keep hearing from these practice reports is Johnny Wilson, right?
Yeah, well, I think Johnny is definitely a receiver. I myself, too, kind of had those questions of, is this a guy who's going to be a tight end? Is he going to be an H-back? What kind of different things are they going to do with him? And I think we've seen Johnny get a little more consistent here in the fall, but that consistency to me is still one of the bigger questions surrounding him. He shows those flash plays. He's made really great contested catches in practice. We've seen him do it at times, but you also see the drops from Johnny. You see those inconsistencies, maybe not that crispness in the route running that you would like to see. But I also think he's come I don't want to say a really long way since he's gotten here, but I think we've seen growth from him. Maybe not quite like Deuce Spann, who I feel like maybe not a completely different player, but he looks so improved. It's very impressive. I think Johnny's going to be a contributor. I don't know what extent he plays or how much they target him. But I think with this FSU receiving group this year, we're going to see each guy have their moment this year. We're going to see guys have quarters. We're going to see guys have halves. We're going to see guys have games. And I think Johnny's certainly going to be one of those guys. I just wonder where he falls in the pecking order. I think there's kind of, I want to say an obvious one or two. I think there's a few guys that stand above the rest, guys like Micah or Malik, right, who we kind of expect to get more targets. But a guy like Johnny, I think, one player goes down here, one player goes down there. He could be an X factor in a game for this team, especially with Winston Wright, kind of, that availability being up in the air right now. We just don't know what that's going to look like in the season. So, yeah, I think Johnny's super talented, and I'm really excited to see his growth because we saw him at the beginning of camp in the spring, and he was so much more inconsistent then than he was now. So I think we've seen him grown a lot for sure. And I'm really excited to see how they use him because I think he can be used in a few different ways too.
I want to ask one more on the wide receivers, and then we'll kind of transition to some of the other newcomers. David, last year you ranked Florida State 14 out of 14 in the ACC. We asked you about that on here, and I don't know if fans were I don't know. Florida State fans aren't reasonable ever, so they probably were at your neck for that. So, but it then the season started, and like, oh, maybe David was right. Talk to us about what your perception of the wide receiver room is now. I for those that watched last year or listened last year, I think every time we asked a question, we'd bounce it to somebody and then say like, okay, well, David, what's the national perspective of this? Like, what's the outside? So David ended up talking more than anybody, but your take on the wide receivers, the transfers, the additions, the guys coming back, and where that room kind of falls right now for Florida State.
Well, first off, I think I should be talking more than anybody as being the best looking and most informed. No, look, this was a thing last year. I took some heat for that. And then, like, as the season went along, the number of times I had people that would be like on Twitter saying, like, crap, you were right. Like, it just was not a good group. And look, if you go back the last 3 seasons, one FSU receiver in the last 3 seasons has topped 400 yards in a year. And that was Tamari Terry. That's insane. That's horrible production. And what's worse, look, the room has been upgraded without question. And the trading Kenny Dillingham for Micah Pittman and Trey Benson, great trade overall. I highly endorse. Bringing in talent has helped that room markedly. And having anybody in there that has some cachet and some experience under their belt that can kind of lead the others. I mean, this is sort of, when you look back at sort of the heyday of FSU's wide receivers, the last great group that came through was that 2012, 13, 14 group. And they had a guy in Rashad Green who was as good a leader in that room as you will ever see. And I'm not sure they've had another good leader since then. I mean, Kelvin Benjamin was not a guy that you want to have as sort of your centerpiece. They had those great recruiting classes, and none of those guys really developed. Tamari Terry was not a guy who you wanted to build your receiving room around, even if he was the most talented guy. They just haven't had that. I think the biggest question I have this time around, and the thing that would hold me back from saying it's a really good group, I think it is a deep group. You mentioned some of these guys that, well, I don't know where their role. Johnny Wilson, big guy. You do Span that's kind of coming in with a little bit different skill set. Having a wealth of skill sets is a huge change of pace for Florida State too. They've tended to have sort of the same guy, and now they've got pieces where you can create matchup problems for the defenses. But what worries me is there a guy? And as you're focusing on filling roles via the transfer portal, it still begs the biggest question that has plagued 3 straight head coaches now, which is, why can't you recruit and develop wide receivers at a place like Florida State? That's insane that that's not happening. So I wouldn't go so far as to say like the problem is fixed, but this is a markedly better situation than it was in a year ago. I do really wonder who is going to be the guy, because if you're Jordan Travis and you're a quarterback who is sort of trying to prove that you are as good a passer as you are a runner, you need sort of that receiver that you feel good about on every play. Like, no matter what happens, I can look for this guy and have a shot. I don't know that there's that guy on this roster, but there's at least 5 or 6 guys that can go out and make plays, which is probably at least 4 to 5 more than they had last year.
Where'd you have them? Did you say, and I just missed it? Where'd you have them ranked?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. It was somewhere like middle of the pack, like 5, 6, 7, something like that, I think. But it was upper half, but not by much. But again, markedly better than last year.